action was one man. They called him Scarface. Al Capone, the most powerful man in the underworld. Back in the 20s, Al Capone lorded over a criminal empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars. For a time, he virtually ruled all of Chicago. Capone's power came from his mix of generosity and brutality. He was willing to pay off anyone who could help him and murder anyone who wouldn't. Today on Biography, we hear from some of the people who knew him well and survived the notorious Al Capone.
Al Capone rose to power with a deadly combination of raw brutality and brains. He wanted the public to love him, but those who dared to cross him knew better.
Scarface Al Capone was a very, very evil man.
For the big fellow, killing was just part of his business plan. A plan to become the CEO of organized crime in Chicago.
Al Capone was not stupid. Hell, if he was a person who took a legal job, he'd be head of General Motors.
But as king of the bootleggers during Prohibition, Scarface Al became more of a celebrity than any mere corporate executive. He became the most famous gangster in the world. Alphonse Capone was a first-generation American, born January 17, 1899. His parents had many dreams when they left Naples for America. But when they settled in Brooklyn, the Capones found hardship. They lived first in a tenement in the crime-filled Navy Yard district. Life was rough for the Capones as they struggled to escape the waterfront. They finally moved, when Al was 10, to a better neighborhood.
He had a perfectly fine mother and father. His mother was devoutly religious to the end of her life. His father was a perfectly respectable barber. No reason to believe that any of the children would grow up to be anything other than perfectly respectable children, and they all grew up to be criminals.
Al's criminal path started early. He joined the toughest local gangs, stole things, and when necessary, used his fists. Young Al had flair. He was a cut above the punks who roamed the neighborhood with him.
When he saw an elderly widow's washboard being stolen when he was a kid, he organized a kid gang to go get it, to retrieve it, to beat up the other kids who stole it, and to return it to her, and then to lead a parade, a sort of a celebratory parade afterwards, in which he could portray himself and play the hero. So even at a very young age, even pre-adolescent, you can sort of begin to see the outlines of the Al Capone who grew up with a kind of a Robin Hood legend.
Capone learned more on the street than he ever did in school. He dropped out in 6th grade after smacking his teacher and in turn getting a thrashing from the principal. What he learned was how to shoot, first with a pool cue, then with a gun. Capone caused trouble with his buddies, but he also helped support his big family. Al tried the straight life, working in a munitions factory, as a pin setter in a bowling alley, and as a cloth cutter in a bookbindery.
He also, as a sideline, became a bouncer out in Coney Island in a bar known as the Harvard Inn, which is kind of a joke because it was owned by a gangster named Frankie Yale. That's where Capone really got his first taste of mob life or gangster life in New York.
It was also where a small-time hoodlum, Frank Galluccio, shielded his little sister, Lena, from Capone's advances and marked 18-year-old Al full life.
Capone came over to the table, bent over and said to Lena, loud enough so that the people at the next table swiveled their heads in surprise at the language, which was strange. "Honey, you got a beautiful ass," and I mean that as a compliment, really.
Defending his sister's honor, Galluccio pulled out a knife and slashed the left side of Capone's face, giving rise to the nickname he hated, Scarface. Capone was ashamed of the scars. sometimes using powder to hide them, preferring to be photographed from the right side, and saying the scars were the result of a war injury. These formative years were when Capone caught the eye of a sharp Brooklyn mobster 17 years his senior. Johnny Torrio would become Capone's role model. Torrio moved to Chicago to run things for Vice Lord Big Jim Colosimo. Big Jim controlled a string of gambling dens and whorehouses. Colosimo's nightclub, just south of downtown, was where the action was. Entertainers, gangsters, and politicians crowded the joint. Big Jim's empire swelled. Torrio needed a lieutenant with brains as well as brawn, so he recruited Capone. With the imminent passage of Prohibition, Al would be an asset to Torrio.
People he knew weren't going to stop drinking, and this opened up a brand new tax-free business to him.
Al Capone, only 19, had just become a father and husband, in that order. He married an Irish girl, May Coughlin, who was 2 years older. Al, May, and their baby came to Chicago in 1919. The city would never be the same. In the roaring 20s, Chicago was synonymous with corruption. Wild nightlife, rampant crime, and flowing booze. When Prohibition became the law in January 1920, it was a special invitation for 20-year-old Al Capone to scheme, move in, take over, and kill anyone who got in his way. Within a few years, Capone would be running a criminal organization the likes of which Chicago had never seen. But first, he had some things to learn from his boss, Johnny Torrio.
Torrio was Capone's mentor. It was coming up through the ranks, being attractive to the boss, having the boss say, this is someone who might succeed me one day. I'm going to bring him along.
You started out in one of the houses of prostitution, either as a bartender slash bouncer slash pimp slash roper. There's stories of supposedly Capone standing outside in front of one of the houses just saying to passersby, hey buddy, we've got some nice girls inside.
The hot spot where Capone worked was Colosimo's nightclub, watering hole for the city's high rollers. With Prohibition, Torrio saw dollar signs. Bootlegging was his answered prayer, but his boss, Big Jim Colosimo, thought he was rich enough and didn't need a new racket.
Without Big Jim, Torrio couldn't expand. Exit Big Jim, but someone had to do it, and it was Capone who was the one who was chosen to arrange it.
Al hired his former New York boss, Frankie Yale, to do the killing. Big Jim was rubbed out in May of 1920 in the lobby of his own club. The style of this hit was to become a hallmark of Capone's murders, planned, deliberate, and witnesses who had sudden amnesia. Now, Torrio and Capone could take over and cash in on bootlegging. Capone had the right instincts, but he still needed some polish.
Torrio took the rough edges off of Capone. Aside from everything else, he insisted that he go to night school to improve his accent. He must have had a Brooklyn accent, but evidently he ended up without that kind of an accent. The people who knew him later in life said, no, he had no particular accent at all.
Capone rose quickly through the ranks of the underworld. He never wanted to be thought of as a criminal, but rather as a gentleman with a passion for opera and the finer things money could buy.
Well, he was a very snappy dresser for those days, but not exactly in the Brooks Brothers mode. He went to yellow and green were his dominant fashion statement colors, with a milky white Borsellino fedora that was a gem. He wore a huge 11.5 carat pinky ring that cost $50,000. He wore Italian glove silk underwear.
His style earned him the nickname he liked, Snorky, meaning sharp dresser. Al was flamboyant. His 5'10.5", 175 pounds, commanding attention as he and his gang swept into nightclubs.
He used to come in with 4 or 5 guys, and they'd all sit at the table, and then the girls would come over, the hostesses in the club. They'd all come around, make a big fuss over him, and he'd give them money. You know, he was very liberal.
Oh, sure, I met him. He was a very nice person, as to know him, you know. And what they said, so many, he never did anything. It was his people that did it. like his men that he had or whatever, do the dirty work.
Many people only believed in Capone's good nature. They didn't see evil, just generosity. Like the time he spilled a drink on a showgirl's new dress.
But it was all wet, and I thought, my God, what am I going to do, you know, like for the rest of the night. So he did give me some money to go and have it taken care of. I didn't want to take it, and he says, no, you take this. He gave me, I think, $25, I think it was.
Well, if he was sitting at the table, he'd call me over, and then every once in a while, when he would come to the club or something, he'd say, get the kid up on the stage and let him do the Charleston, you know, and I'd get a $5 bill. And that was terrific, you know.
Capone's family thought he was terrific, too. When his father died in 1920, Al, the dutiful son, brought his family to Chicago. Together, the Capones lived in a 15-room house on the South Side. He brought his brothers into the rackets and supported his sisters comfortably. To the day she died, his younger sister, Mafalda, defended him, writing, I know nothing about his activities outside the family and do not recall any conversations about business matters. Outside the family, he was a different guy.
He was regularly unfaithful. He was a lusty man who was dealing with prostitutes and sampled the wares. He would get drunk. He would be away from home for long periods of time. He, in effect, would live away from home.
When he wasn't out drinking, gambling, or whoring, Capone studied his boss, Torrio. He learned how Chicago was divvied up and how to bring gangland together to fill the city's thirst for alcohol. In 1922, under Torrio's design, local mobsters made a peace agreement. Everyone would get a cut of the action.
That was Torrio's modus operandi, to try and get everybody together and agree. And Capone learned that from Torrio. I think Capone learned to suppress his perhaps naturally violent instincts.
This strategy turned bootlegging into big business. Supply was controlled, from breweries to backyard stills. Saloon owners, if they were smart, bought Capone's beer.
If you didn't, they would come back and tell you, you better take their beer. This happened over and over again. If you didn't do that again, they would bomb your place, and they would blow out the windows. And then they would offer to lend you the money to repair it. Well, nobody else would give you the money to repair your place. Of course, once you did that, you were in effect in business with the Capone organization.
The government's estimate is that they took in, on average, $120 million a year in sales from liquor, prostitution, and gambling, basically. So they were the equivalent of a probably medium-sized corporation. And it was run in many ways like a business. There were guys with specific functions, like in charge of beer truck repair, in charge of brewery construction, in charge of brewery management.
Capone was a brilliant businessman and a brilliant organizer. He couldn't invest money in the conventional sense because that would supply the government with a trail to his organization. So it was an all-cash business that he was in, which was the trinity of gambling, prostitution, and vice.
Capone also guaranteed protection from the law by bribing cops and politicians.
Al Capone himself once estimated that 50% of the Chicago police force worked for him. So that's a big part of doing business. Otherwise, you wouldn't operate for a minute if you weren't getting protection.
1922 was the year that Capone finally got officially noticed by the Chicago press. In the early hours of August 30th, he was arrested after a night of boozing. Capone's temper erupted when the car he was driving slammed into a taxi, badly injuring the driver. He pulled a gun and threatened the taxi driver, waving around a fake sheriff's badge. When the real police showed up, Capone was arrested. He taunted the officer, boasting that he'd fix this thing. Easy. He did. The charges were dropped. Word that Al walked got around fast. His legend was growing. Now just 23 years old, Al became Torrio's partner at the top of the crime world. While attempts to quench the public's thirst stepped up, so did greed. In 1923, the gangland peace negotiated under Torrio shattered. Chicago's notorious beer wars began and grabbed headlines nationwide. Blood flowed and bombs exploded from September through December. For Capone's enemies, it ended in death.
The only thing these guys